The rain did not fall so much as it attacked the valley, a punishing, wind-whipped deluge that turned the ranch yard into a churning sea of mud and swallowed the distant mountains in a shroud of angry gray. Inside his sturdy log home, Caleb banked the fire, the warm glow doing little to push back the howl of the storm at his door. It was a night for no living thing to be abroad, a night that spoke of staying put and waiting for the world to calm. The wind roared like a living beast, and in a rare lull, a new sound sliced through the noise, not the crack of a branch, but a weak, thumping rhythm against the heavy oak door. It was too steady, too desperate to be anything but human. Caleb's brow furrowed, and he crossed the room in 3 long strides, heaving the door open against the gale. The figure on his porch was less a person and more a collection of drenched rags and trembling limbs, washed into the dim circle of firelight spilling from within. It was a young woman, her dress plastered to her slight frame, her hair dark, streaming net across her pale face. Her eyes, when she lifted her head, were the widest, most fearful eyes Caleb had ever seen, the color of a storm-ridden sky just before the break. She hugged herself, her teeth chattering so violently she could barely speak. I am sorry to trouble you," she managed, her voice a threadbare whisper almost stolen by the wind. Might I have shelter in your barn? Just for the night. I can leave at first light." The request was polite, but the terror behind it was a raw, living thing. She glanced over her shoulder into the blackness, not as one simply fleeing bad weather, but as one being pursued by it. Caleb took in the mud caked to her worn shoes, the way her shoulders hunched not just from cold but from a deep, bone-weary dread. Letting a stranger into his barn was one thing, letting this drowned, frightened creature spend the night alone in his cold, shadowy loft was something his conscience, a stubborn and weathered thing, would not allow. "The barn's no place tonight," he said, his voice low and gravelly but not unkind. "Winds like to take the roof clean off. Come inside." He stepped back, holding the door wider. She hesitated, a wild animal weighing the trap against the storm. Another gust of icy rain decided for her. She stumbled across the threshold, water pooling instantly at her feet on the worn wooden floor. Caleb closed the door, and the sudden quiet was heavy, broken only by the crackle of the fire and the frantic drumming of rain on the roof. She stood rooted, dripping and shaking, as if afraid to move further into the warm space. "Get by the fire," he instructed, moving to a heavy chest and pulling out a thick, woolen blanket. He held it out to her, but she simply stared at his outstretched hand, confusion and fear warring in her expression. Understanding dawned on him slowly. She was so used to roughness that simple kindness seemed a foreign language. He draped the blanket gently over her shoulders himself, its weight seeming to surprise her. "I'm Caleb. This is my ranch. You're safe from the weather here." She pulled the blanket tight, burying her fingers in its coarse weave. "Mira," she whispered, the name a secret she was parting with. Thank you." She edged toward the fireplace, her movements cautious and precise, as if her body ached. She held her hands out to the flames, the light catching on the delicate bones of her wrists and, for a fleeting second, on a faded, yellowish mark that circled one of them like an old bracelet. She quickly tucked her hand back into the blanket's folds. Caleb busied himself heating a pot of stew left from his supper, the rich scent of meat and herbs soon filling the room. He placed a bowl and a spoon on the rough-hewn table. "Eat," he said, not as a command, but as a simple statement of what needed to be done. Mira watched him for a moment, then sat, her movements still small and careful. She ate slowly at first, then with a hunger that spoke of days without a proper meal. He turned away, pretending to examine a harness, to give her the privacy of her need. When she was finished, she sat quietly, the color slowly returning to her cheeks. "I can work," she said suddenly, her eyes fixed on the empty bowl. I am good with animals. I can mend and cook. I do not expect charity. If I could stay, just for a little while, to earn my way? The plea was in her eyes, though her voice tried to sound strong. Caleb studied her. He saw the weariness, the fear, but also a flicker of fierce will beneath it. His ranch was large, his life solitary. An extra pair of hands, especially gentle ones, was not unwelcome. But more than that, he saw a soul caught in a tempest far worse than the one outside. The dairy cow always seems to find the one weak spot in the fence, he said, his tone matter of fact. And the chickens are a messy bunch. Could use a steady hand to keep their coop in order. That's a fair trade for room and board, if it suits you. The relief that washed over her face was so profound it was like watching a candle flame grow steady after being buffeted by the wind. Her shoulders, which had been held tight up near her ears, softened just a little. It suits me very well, Mr. Caleb. Thank you. He showed her to a small, plain room at the back of the house, one that held a narrow bed, a washstand, and a simple chest. It was clean and, most importantly, it had a solid door with a good latch on the inside. This is yours, he said. Rest. The storm's still talking, but these walls have heard worse. You'll hear the rooster if you sleep past dawn. He gave her a small, stiff nod, the closest he came to a smile, and left her, pulling her door shut behind him. Back by the fire, Caleb listened to the quiet sounds from the other room, the soft creak of the floorboards, the rustle of the dry blankets. He stared into the flames, thinking of the fear in her storm-gray eyes, the way she had looked into the darkness as if it held a shape only she could see. He had not just offered a job to a stranger tonight, he had, without fully meaning to, thrown a rope to someone who was drowning. He did not know from what, but as the rain finally softened to a gentle patter on the roof, he knew his quiet, solitary world had shifted. A seed, small and fragile, had been planted in the muddy ground of that terrible night, and he found himself, for the first time in a long time, wondering what kind of plant it might grow into. The rhythm of the ranch, steady and sun-marked as the passage of the seasons, absorbed Mira into its flow. Days began with the rooster's cry and ended with the soft lowing of cattle settling in the far pasture. Under the vast, open sky, some of the tight fear in her began, slowly, to unravel. She proved true to her word, possessing a natural, quiet skill with the animals. The dairy cow, Bessie, would turn her great head and nudge Mira's pocket for the apple slice she always saved. The chickens, usually a skittish flock, would cluck contentedly around her feet as she scattered their grain. Caleb watched this from a distance, a silent witness to her transformation. The pale, rain-drenched ghost on his porch was being replaced by a woman with careful hands and a focused gaze, though the shadows in her eyes never fully disappeared. Evenings became a new and settled ritual. They would share a simple supper at the long table, the fire painting warm shapes on the log walls. At first, their conversation was like a shy creek, finding its way around stones, talk of the weather, a fence that needed mending, the health of a horse. But as the weeks softened into a month, the creek deepened. Mira began to ask him questions about the land, the names of the distant peaks, the story of how he had built this ranch from nothing. Caleb, a man of few words, found himself speaking more, describing the first hard winter, the joy of finding the hidden spring that watered the high meadow. He liked the way she listened, her whole attention given, as if his words were a map she was carefully memorizing. One such evening, after a day of hauling fresh hay to the barn, Caleb noticed a change. Mira moved with a new, subtle confidence as she cleared the plates, but her face was pale, and her eyes held a distant, glassy look. She had been quiet throughout the meal, speaking only when spoken to. "You're tired," he stated, not unkindly. "It was a long day. You should rest." She nodded, but the movement was stiff. Yes. Rest. Her voice was faint. She turned toward the hallway, then paused, her hand resting on the doorframe of her room as if for support. She looked back at him, and in the flickering light, her expression was one of such profound sorrow and exhaustion that it stopped his breath. "Thank you, Caleb," she said, the words heavy with a meaning he could not yet grasp. For the quiet. The house settled into its nighttime sounds, the pop of cooling logs in the fireplace, the sigh of the wind in the eaves. Caleb sat in his chair by the dying fire, mending a torn bridle, but his thoughts were in the quiet room down the hall. A deep unease had taken root in his gut. He was about to retire to his own room when he heard it, a sound so small and shattered it was barely there at all. A muffled cry, choked off into a whimper. He stood, listening intently. It came again, followed by the frantic rustle of bedding. He moved down the hallway, his boots silent on the plank floor, and stopped outside her door. From within, he could hear her voice, thick with sleep and terror, pleading with someone who wasn't there. "No, please. I have it. I'll be good, don't." The words dissolved into a sob that was all the more terrible for being stifled. Caleb's hand, large and calloused, hovered near the latch. To enter a woman's bedchamber unasked was the height of impropriety, a line no honorable man would cross. But to stand and listen to this private agony felt like a worse sin. The crying ceased, replaced by a shaky, ragged breathing. He knocked softly on the wood. "Mira? Are you unwell?" A long silence. Then, the latch lifted, and the door opened just a crack. She stood there, wrapped in the same blanket he'd given her that first night, her face streaked with tears in the faint moonlight from her small window. She looked impossibly young and utterly broken. "I am sorry to disturb you," she whispered, her voice raw. "It is only a dream." "It's a loud one," he said gently, his own voice low. "Do you have them often?" She looked down at her hands, twisting the blanket's edge. "Only every night," she confessed, the truth dragged from her as if it were a physical weight. She took a shaky breath, her next words barely audible. "In them, my father, he finds me. He always finds me. He sneaks in every night, in the dream, and he takes me back." She looked up then, and the sheer, unvarnished terror in her eyes struck Caleb like a blow. "He says a lock won't keep him out. He says promises won't keep him out. He says he will always get what is his." Caleb felt a cold anger bloom in his chest, not hot and flashing, but deep and hard as winter iron. He finally understood the shape of the shadow that haunted her, the reason she flinched at a raised voice, the meaning behind the careful way she moved, as if expecting a blow. This was not just a bad dream, it was memory, wearing a nightmare's face, visiting her with cruel regularity. He looked at her, standing in her doorway, a prisoner in a fortress of her own mind every time she closed her eyes. He thought of all the rules, all the lines of what was proper and what was not. Then he thought of the sound of her stifled sobs. The unthinkable became, in that instant, the only thing to do. "Wait here," he said. He turned and walked to the main room, returning a moment later with his own thick, coiled bedroll and a second, heavier blanket. Without a word of explanation, he stepped past her, giving her a wide berth so as not to frighten her, and into her room. He ignored the bed, instead laying the bedroll out on the woven rug directly in front of her closed door. He spread the blanket over it, creating a pallet on the hard floor. Mira watched, her confusion cutting through her fear. "Caleb, what are you? You cannot sleep there." "I can," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. He sat on the makeshift bed, his back against the door, a solid barrier of flesh and bone between her and the outside world. He looked up at her, his face grave but calm in the moonlight. You said a lock won't keep him out. Maybe not in a dream. But this? He nodded to his own large frame, blocking the doorway. Nothing and no one gets past me tonight. Not even a dream. You have my word on it. He saw her throat work as she swallowed a new wave of emotion. Not fear this time, but something that threatened to overwhelm her just as completely. She did not thank him again with words. She simply gave a small, trembling nod, her eyes holding his for a long moment, pouring a universe of gratitude and dawning trust into that silent look. She slowly walked back to her bed and slipped beneath the covers, turning on her side to face him, as if to assure herself he was real. Caleb shifted, finding a position against the door, listening to the night. He heard her breathing slowly deepen, the tremulous rhythm evening out into the soft, steady cadence of true sleep. He sat his watch through the long, dark hours, his own eyes growing heavy but never closing fully. Just before dawn, as the first gray light touched the window, he heard her sigh in her sleep, a soft, peaceful sound he had never heard from her before. He knew then, with a certainty that settled into his very bones, that he had crossed a line from which there was no return. He was no longer just her employer, or even simply her protector. He had become her sanctuary. And in the quiet of that vigil, the fragile seed planted in the storm took a deep, strong root, growing silently in the dark. The floorboard vigil became a new, unspoken cornerstone of their lives. Caleb did not sleep outside her door every night, for that would have been a strange and stifling thing. But on the nights he heard the first restless whimpers through the wall, or saw the old shadowed fear return to Mira's eyes at dusk, he would, without a word, take up his bedroll and blanket. He would give her a quiet nod, and she would answer with a look of profound relief. Some nights, he stayed for only an hour, until her breathing grew deep and even. Other nights, he remained until the sky lightened. It was a simple, powerful medicine, the solid, breathing presence of another person who had promised, "Nothing gets past me." The nightmares, while not banished completely, lost their sharpest claws. Mira began to sleep through whole nights, and a new kind of peace, soft as dandelion fluff, settled upon the ranch house. With the gift of rest came a blossoming. The careful, quiet woman who helped with the chores began to unfurl like a wild rose in a sunny patch. Caleb noticed the small changes first. She hummed sometimes while kneading bread, a faint, tuneless sound of contentment. She planted a few flowers, tough, bright marigolds and creeping thyme, by the front step, a tiny declaration that this was a home, not just a shelter. One afternoon, he came upon her in the pasture with Bessie the cow. She was not just tending the animal, but resting her cheek against its warm flank, her eyes closed, a small smile on her face as she absorbed the simple, sun-soaked peace. The sight of it caught in Caleb's chest, a sweet, aching pull he could not name. The air between them grew warmer, charged with a new and delicate understanding. A passing of a tool meant fingers might brush, and the touch no longer made her flinch, but rather brought a faint blush to her cheeks. Their conversations by the fire lingered longer, venturing into memories of childhood, his of fishing in a cold mountain stream, hers, carefully offered, of her mother's love of songbirds before she passed. They shared silences that were no longer empty, but full and comfortable. Then came the evening of the first real thaw, when winter's last grip finally loosened. The setting sun poured liquid honey through the west-facing window, gilding the dust motes dancing in the air. Mira had just finished washing the supper dishes, her sleeves rolled up, her forearms damp. Caleb was at the table, looking over a ledger. She moved to dry her hands by the fire, the golden light painting her in its glow, making her simple dress look like a garment of light. She turned to him, her expression soft and open, utterly unguarded. "Caleb," she said, her voice quieter than the crackle of the pine log, I have not had a bad dream in 7 nights. He closed the ledger, giving her his full attention. That's good, he said, the words feeling too simple for the importance of the news. It is because of you, she continued, taking a small step toward him. Because I know you are here. Because I feel safe. She looked down at her hands, then back up at him, her storm gray eyes clear and deep. I do not know how to repay such a kindness. No repayment needed, he said, standing. The space between them seemed to shrink, charged with the quiet of the room and the weight of her words. He moved closer, not with intent, but as if drawn by an invisible cord. This is your home, Mira. For as long as you want it. Forever, if that's your wish. The word forever hung in the air, a promise bigger than any he had ever made. Her eyes welled with tears, but they were not tears of sadness or fear. They were the bright, sparkling tears of a profound release. A small, breathless sound escaped her, part laugh, part sob. Without thinking, driven by a force deeper than propriety, Caleb reached out and gently caught a tear as it traced its path down her cheek with the rough pad of his thumb. The touch was a spark to dry tinder. Mira did not pull away. Instead, she leaned into his hand, her own coming up to cover his, holding it against her face. Her skin was impossibly soft, and the trust in the gesture sent a tremor through him. He lowered his head, his gaze dropping to her lips, then back to her eyes, a silent question. Her answer was in the slight tilt of her chin, the parting of her lips, the way her eyelids fluttered closed. The kiss was not fierce or demanding. It was a slow, tender exploration, a silent conversation more eloquent than any words they had ever shared. It tasted of salt from her tears and the sweet, warm tea they had drunk after supper. It was a seal upon the promise of forever, a physical embodiment of the safety and the deep, growing affection that had woven itself around them. Her hand slid up to rest on his shoulders, and encircled her waist, pulling her gently against him. For a long, timeless moment. The golden peace of the ranch was gone, replaced by a watchful, wire-tight tension. Jasper's visit had been a poison in the well, tainting every familiar sight and sound. The creak of a branch in the wind was no longer just the wind, the distant cry of a nighthawk held a predatory edge. Mira moved through her days like a living shadow of her former self. The new lightness in her step was gone, the quiet hum silenced. Her eyes, which had begun to hold the soft reflection of the sky, now constantly scanned the horizon, the tree line, the mouth of the track, dark with a hunted dread that Caleb felt like a physical pain in his own chest. He knew Jasper's type. The man's parting threat was not an empty boast, but a blueprint. He would not ride up and knock. He would come like a thief in the night, or in the gray confusion of dawn, with force and cunning to take what he believed was his. Caleb's protective instincts, once a gentle fortress of floorboards and promises, hardened into a cold, strategic resolve. He would not wait to be overrun. He began to prepare. First, he spoke to Mira, his voice low and steady, laying out a plan as if discussing the rotation of a field. He will come from the west track, or try to cut through the lower creek bed to approach unseen, he told her. He showed her the sturdy root cellar, a small, dirt-walled room beneath the kitchen, its door hidden by a heavy rug and a trapdoor. If you hear anything at all that is not me or the normal sounds of the night, you go here. You pull the rug over and you do not make a sound until I call for you by name. Do you understand? She nodded, her face pale but set, memorizing the plan as if it were a lifeline. Next, he turned the ranch itself into a sentinel. He spent a day carefully stringing a web of nearly invisible fishing line between fence posts and shrubs along the most likely approaches, attaching old tin cups with a few pebbles inside. A careless step in the dark would send a quiet, jangling alarm into the stillness. He deliberately left Bessie the cow in the small paddock closest to the house. She was a gentle creature, but she was large and disliked strangers, and her uneasy lowing at an unexpected presence would be another kind of bell. He moved with a quiet, grim purpose, checking the bolts on doors and windows, ensuring his rifle was clean and loaded, and keeping a heavy axe and a thick oak cudgel within easy reach by the front and back doors. Mira watched all this, her fear slowly being tempered by a new, steely determination. She did not wring her hands or plead. Instead, she made herself useful. She prepared a small bundle of food, a water skin, and a blanket for the root cellar. She oiled the hinges on the trapdoor so it would open and close without a sound. And she took upon herself the most important task of all. She became the keeper of the light. Each evening, she would place a single, shuttered lantern by the hearth, its wick trimmed and ready. "If I must hide," she told Caleb, her voice firm, "I will not be fumbling in the dark. And if you need a signal, a quick flash at a window will carry far." 3 nights passed, each one stretching longer than the last, a slow torture of anticipation. On the 4th night, the moon was a thin, cold sliver, offering little light. The wind had picked up, moaning in the eaves and masking smaller sounds, the perfect night for a wicked deed. Caleb did not pretend to sleep. He sat in the main room, his chair positioned to see both the front window and the hallway to the bedrooms, the oak cudgel across his knees. Mira was in her room, instructed to lie down fully dressed. The house was a held breath. It was Bessie who gave the first, soft warning, not a panicked bellow, but a long, uneasy moo that was out of place in the deep night. Caleb was on his feet instantly, moving to the front window. He saw nothing, but the feeling was a cold stone in his gut. A moment later, from the direction of the lower creek bed, came a faint, discordant rattle-tap. One of his tin cup alarms had been triggered. He moved swiftly down the hall, pushing Mira's door open. She was already sitting upright on the edge of her bed, her eyes wide in the gloom. "The creek bed," he whispered. "Now. Go." She did not hesitate. She slipped past him, a silent ghost, and vanished into the kitchen. He heard the faint, well-oiled whisper of the trapdoor opening and closing. The sound, proof of her safety, freed him to act. Caleb moved out the back door, melting into the deep shadows of the house. He could hear them now, muffled curses, the clumsy rustle of men trying to move quietly through unfamiliar terrain. He saw 3 shapes detach from the blackness near the barn. Jasper was in the lead, a darker shadow holding what looked like a coiled rope. 2 other burly men flanked him. They were headed straight for the house. Caleb did not shout a challenge. He simply stepped out into the open yard, blocking their path, the cudgel held loosely at his side. "You're trespassing," he said, his voice cutting through the wind. Jasper stopped short, his companions spreading out to either side. "Trespassing on my own business?" Jasper sneered. "Hand her over, rancher. This doesn't need to get ugly." "It already is," Caleb said. "Leave. Now." With a sharp gesture from Jasper, the 2 men rushed him. What followed was not a gentleman's duel or a heroic, choreographed fight. It was a brutal, desperate struggle in the near dark. Caleb met the first man with a solid, sweeping blow of the cudgel that caught him in the ribs with a sickening thump, dropping him to the dirt with a grunt of agony. The second man was on him then, grappling, his breath hot and sour. They fell together, rolling in the dust, a tangle of fists and knees. Caleb felt a blow glance off his jaw, saw stars, but used his greater weight to pin the man, landing 2 short, hard punches to his face before shoving him away. Jasper had hung back, but now he saw his opening. As Caleb pushed himself to his knees, Jasper lunged, not with fists, but with the rope, aiming to loop it around Caleb's neck from behind. Caleb twisted, the coarse fibers burning against his cheek instead, and he grabbed Jasper's wrist, the two men straining against each other, their faces inches apart in the gloom. Inside the house, Mira crouched in the absolute blackness of the root cellar, her hands pressed over her mouth. The sounds of the struggle were muted but terrible: thuds, grunts, the harsh rasp of men fighting for their lives. The fear that threatened to paralyze her was suddenly burned away by a white-hot surge of fury. This man, her father, had haunted her dreams, stolen her peace, and now he was here to destroy the one good, true thing in her life. She would not hide and let it happen. She thought of the lantern. Up in the kitchen, the fight had staggered toward the back porch. Caleb and Jasper were locked together, stumbling against the water trough. One of the other men was struggling to his feet, shaking his head. Caleb knew he was outnumbered and tiring. Then, from the kitchen window, a blinding flash of light cut through the night, once, twice, 3 times. It was Mira, signaling not for help, but in defiance. The sudden light had an instant, chaotic effect. Jasper flinched, his grip loosening for a split second. The man trying to rise squinted, blinded. And the horses, tied in the trees nearby, spooked by the strange flashing from the dark house, whinnied and jerked at their reins. In that moment of confusion, Mira acted. She threw open the back door, not with a scream, but with a voice that rang out clear and cold as a knife blade. "The sheriff is on his way. I've seen his lanterns on the ridge." It was a bluff, but delivered with such conviction that it froze the attackers. Seizing the chaos, she did not attack the men, but the root of their power. She grabbed a heavy iron skillet from the hook by the door and hurled it with all her strength not at a person, but at the ground near the spooked horses. The deafening clang on the stone step was the final shock. The horses reared, breaking their tethers, and bolted into the night. The fight went out of Jasper's men. A sheriff coming? Their horses gone? The one Caleb had kicked in the ribs moaned, "Jasper, this is bust." The other was already backing away, hand to his bleeding nose. Jasper himself stood panting, his face a mask of pure, impotent rage. He was defeated not just by Caleb's strength, but by the unexpected, fierce resistance of the woman he had thought broken. The practical reality of being stranded on a hostile ranch, possibly with lawmen coming, settled on him. Caleb, his breath coming in ragged gasps, straightened up, hefting the cudgel. "Get your men off my land," he ordered, his voice gravelly with exhaustion and triumph. "You can walk." There was no proud retreat. It was a sullen, limping surrender. The 2 hired men, one clutching his side, the other his face, stumbled off into the darkness toward the road. Jasper cast one last, venomous look at Mira, who stood tall in the doorway, backlit by the lantern light she now held high, no longer a frightened girl but a warrior defending her home. He then turned and vanished after his companions, swallowed by the night. As the sounds of their retreat faded, the tension snapped. Mira's strength seemed to leave her all at once, and the lantern wavered in her hand. Caleb was at her side in 2 strides, taking the light and pulling her into his arms. She trembled now, the reaction setting in, but she was not crying. She was looking up at him, her eyes searching his bruised face in the flickering glow. "You're hurt," she whispered. "I'm home," he corrected softly, holding her tighter. He looked over her head at the quiet, reclaimed night. The battle was over. The nightmare, at last, had been faced down not in dreams, but in the real world, and it had been banished. In its place stood a man and a woman, bruised but unbroken, bound now not just by promise or need, but by the unshakable trust forged in the fire of a shared fight. The rescue was complete. The dawn that broke over the valley the next morning felt unlike any other. It was not merely the sun rising, but a world being made anew. The air, scrubbed clean by the night wind, held the sweet, damp scent of earth and promise. With Jasper's poisonous shadow finally lifted, a profound and healing quiet descended upon the ranch, a silence not of absence, but of peace so deep it hummed in the soul. The roots of their life together, tested by storm and tempered in conflict, now stretched deep and unshakable into the good soil of their shared ground. In the days that followed, the rhythms of work returned, but they were transformed. Mira no longer glanced over her shoulder. The songs she hummed as she gardened were louder, truer, and sometimes she would simply stop, her face tilted to the sun, drinking in the warmth as if it were a holy thing. Caleb's bruises faded from purple to yellow to a memory, and he found himself watching her with a wonder that never grew old. He saw not a victim he had saved, but a partner he had fought beside, a woman of quiet strength and resilient grace who had chosen him, and this life, with her whole heart. The love between them, once a tender seedling sheltered from the storm, now grew in the open, strong and unafraid. Their wedding was a simple affair, as befitted their world. It took place under the ancient, sprawling oak tree at the crest of the pasture, its leaves whispering blessings in the summer breeze. The preacher from the distant town came, a few neighboring ranchers and their families stood as witnesses, and the sky was a boundless, cloudless blue. Mira wore a dress of simple cream linen, with a crown of wildflowers braided into her dark hair. Caleb stood straight and solemn in his best shirt, but when he took her hands in his thumbs tracing gentle circles over her knuckles, his eyes held a warmth that made the formal words of the ceremony seem like echoes of a truth they already knew. When he was told he could kiss his bride, he did so with a gentle reverence that spoke of forever, and the small crowd cheered. The celebration was a picnic on blankets, with hearty food, laughter that rang out clear and free, and music from a fiddle that had not been played at the ranch in many years. It was not a grand event, but it was a full one, brimming with the honest joy of a community welcoming a new family. Life settled into a contented pattern, richer and sweeter for all that had come before. The ranch prospered under their combined care. Mira's gentle touch extended beyond the animals to a thriving kitchen garden and pots of herbs on the windowsill that filled the house with fragrant smells. Caleb taught her to ride properly, not for escape, but for the joy of exploring their own land together. Evenings were spent on the porch, watching the stars emerge, talking of small plans and big dreams, a new corral, perhaps a fruit orchard on the south slope. The floor outside her bedroom door remained forever empty. The only guard Caleb kept now was the one of a loving husband, sleeping soundly with his wife safe in the circle of his arms. The story concludes not with a grand event, but with a perfect, ordinary moment. On a morning some years later, Caleb awoke as the first pale light of dawn gently grayed the room. He turned on his side, and now familiar and profound contentment settling in his chest. Mira slept beside him, her dark hair fanned across the pillow, one hand resting lightly on the patchwork quilt over the gentle swell of her belly where new life grew. Her face was serene, lips parted slightly in untroubled sleep. No frown marred her brow, no whimper escaped her. She dreamed, he knew, but they were dreams of her own making, of a full pantry, of a laughing child, of a future built with her own two hands and a steadfast heart. Caleb did not rise. He lay still, watching her, watching the light slowly turn from gray to gold as the sun began to brush the high peaks. He remembered the drowned, trembling ghost on his porch in the rain, the sound of her nightmares through the wall, the fierce blaze of defiance in her eyes as she stood in the doorway with a lantern. He thought of the promise he had made to a terrified woman, that nothing would get past him. That promise had been kept. It had deepened, widened, and transformed into this, a shared life, a safe harbor, a love as solid and enduring as the land itself. The rescue was long complete, the acceptance total, the trust absolute. The unexpected love had become the very foundation of his world. As the sun finally crested the ridge, flooding their room with warm, buttery light, Mira's eyes fluttered open. She saw him watching her, and without a word, a slow, sleepy smile spread across her face, a smile of pure, unguarded happiness. She shifted closer, tucking her head against his shoulder with a sigh of perfect peace. Caleb pressed a kiss to her forehead, closed his eyes, and listened to the ranch and his world waking up around them. All was well, and all would be well. Here, under this roof, the story had found its happy ending, and a new, brighter story was just beginning. If you enjoyed following Caleb and Mira's journey from fearful strangers to a family bound by unwavering trust and love, consider subscribing for more tales of unexpected romance, quiet courage, and hearts finding their home. New stories await, just over the next ridge.